Welcome to another edition of Everybody Hates Cleveland.com, the podcast. I am your host, as always, Jim Pete. Today, joined by Michael Hattery, as always, and Adam Burke, who I think you were on once before, not with me, but with Mike. But, gentlemen, the day after the Indians trade Nick Swisher and Michael Bourn, I guess let's start this a little different than most other podcasts and radio shows. How are you feeling about 2015?
It's garbage. No, I mean, 2015, I think Adam noted it before we went on air. The Indians are kind of in this point in the season where they score 9 runs and lose a baseball game, but I do think there's this certain point where this season has become something beyond frustration, and really just watching them take it in the teeth and still not really be playing young guys, be tinkering with Chisenhall, getting Raburn at bats when you have Ramsey and, in the soon eventuality, Naquin hanging out down there, I think is pretty frustrating. Also Walters. So I think watching a team with some veteran / floating around just scrap heap guys rather than kind of monitoring what you have at the big league level makes the last couple of weeks, other than the deals, pretty tough to watch.
Yeah, and I think we're going to get a pretty good indication of that on Saturday night, because there's going to be a fly ball pitcher in Trevor Bauer on the mound, and the outfield, assuming Tyler Holt has already been sent down, and presumably for a bullpen arm, because why not? GM Terry Francona is still pulling the roster moves there, but you're going to have an outfield of either Ryan Raburn, Mike Aviles, or Jerry Sands in left field, with Michael Brantley in center field and Lion Chisenhall in right field, with a fly ball pitcher on the mound. And the sad thing is, this sort of almost pays homage to the month of April, where we had Mikey doing a good job in center field, and it's sad to see them at this point where when they do have talented options that they could bring up and take a look at.
Well, Chris Antonetti, and I think as the season has progressed, we've seen kind of a divide between Antonetti and Francona, perhaps not in friendship, but in definitely what their thought process is. Antonetti said yesterday that the whole idea of this was to look forward to 2016 and see what they had here in 2015. Are we going to see Ramsey at any point? Why haven't we seen him yet? Are we going to see Naquin when he's healthy? Are we going to see any of these guys, or is this going to be like a march through the Columbus bullpen? And I mean, there's not even anybody in the rotation worth talking about. So are we going to see any, or maybe it's Aguilar's hour? Everybody's looking to see him get a lot of at bats.
What I think is bothersome about all of it is that you still will have these same questions next year, and getting a glimpse of these guys in 50 plate appearances in September, against fellow call-ups, you can't really gauge a whole lot from that. And to continue giving away at-bats to Ryan Raburn and Jerry Sands and Mike Aviles, in the month of August, that just sets the organization back at the beginning of next year, because unless they trade a Carrasco or Salazar to get a controlled outfield bat, you're still entering next year with no true center fielder. You're entering next year without a true right fielder, and you've got utility guys like Ramirez and Chisenhall, but you need to find out if you have any everyday players. And Ramsey may not be that guy. Maybe Naquin is, maybe Walters can be, but we don't know. And the fact that they don't take the time to figure these things out, when these guys can get a meaningful 150 plate appearances, it's extremely frustrating, because they won't go be that active in free agency, because they really can ill afford to wind up in the same situation that they just got themselves out of.
Yeah, I think the most frustrating thing is going to be packing it in with Raburn and Sands and Aviles for the next month, and then we make the courtesy September calls and get 40 at-bats out of Naquin and Ramsey. And I think another piece really is to what they're going to do once Jason Kipnis returns. Because I'd really like to see Jose Ramirez be the primary utility guy. I think it plays best there, and I think that's kind of the future of that position in the organization. But I think what we're going to see is we're going to see the twilight era of Mike Aviles in September, when he might as well be at home with his family, and Jose Ramirez should be on the baseball field. And I think when Kipnis is healthy, Aviles is going to continue getting dominant playing time, and Ramirez is going to be scaled back, and we're going to cut his ABs for somebody who has no future in the organization, and we're going to give 30 here to Sands, 30 here to Chisenhall, 40 here to Ramsey, 30 here to Naquin, which really serves no purpose other than to continue to cloud a picture that needs to be more clear.
Well, you guys are ignoring the all-star to be that is Chris Johnson.
I'm not ignoring him because he exists. Right now he's the second highest paid player on the team for next year, so it's kind of hard to ignore that. But basically you look at him. He's played, I believe, he has one appearance in the outfield in his major league career. He's an awful third baseman, so he's another first baseman / DH type that they're going to have to deal with. Use him 25% of the time when they face a lefty, and it is what it is. They managed to get themselves out of the Bourn and Swisher contracts, and then Antonetti to come out and say, well, the financial flexibility was good, but the roster flexibility was better, and then to see that Terry Francona is going to pull the same BS that he's pulled all season long, playing his beloved veterans, it's so counterproductive that these two, maybe they do have a good friendship, but their working relationship, in my opinion, and Jim, you know this, I wrote about this way back in April.
Yeah.
It's dysfunctional, and it's really hurt them this season. And the problem is it's going to hurt them in future seasons because there's no signs that it'll change.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I'll go here. I think there is this. I think a lot of people are frustrated by the realities of being a small market and kind of the roster and payroll constraints, but it has other constraints too. And I think when you're operating on really, really thin margins, I think the organizations that we see succeed consistently in small markets are ones with a shared vision and practical approach on the field and in the front office. We've seen in Tampa Bay where the manager, it doesn't really matter who the manager is, they hire managers who have a synergy and vision with the front office and general manager. And we've seen it in Oakland as well, where Bean picks managers who can kind of practically apply what strategically he believes is optimal. Whereas in Cleveland, we have a very analytical, forward-thinking front office paired with a more traditional manager who has a lot of power. And I think that really, especially in a small market, is incredibly costly because the Indians build teams that have to be used efficiently and optimized more so with platoon bats, with defensive placements than other teams with larger financial margins have. And that lack of synergy is super, super costly and really concerning.
Well, and I guess the hope here is as we go forward, and Adam, we've talked about this on Twitter a ton, and I know Mike and I have as well. I guess the hope here would be that after a year like this where I think all of us thought this team was going to be a lot better than they ended up being, the hope here is that Antonetti maybe garners a bit of power, but I think the belief with all three of us is that, there was a handshake deal or whatever you want to think between Shapiro, Antonetti, and Francona, that Francona basically could make these kinds of moves. Do either of you see this shifting in the future? And if it doesn't, what are we looking forward to at the end of perhaps next year? And we'll get into the deal in a second, but this is important because while we've cleared a ton of payroll money, and depending on what you believe is being stated about that $10 million, and we'll get into that in a second, they have cleared all this money, but if Francona is still making the same types of moves next year, no matter what they do this offseason, we're going to run into the same types of problems. So might this change, or are we heading for another end-of-era Francona in Cleveland the same way we saw him kind of get bounced out of Boston, where he did win 2 World Series in their first 2 World Series in almost 100 years? So what are we in for? Are we in for a change, or are we in for the same thing?
Well, I think what you have to do if you're Chris Antonetti, and fortunately he's in a position to do this, is to take Francona's toys away from him. Mike Aviles is a free agent. That's an option they should have never picked up for this season anyway. But now there's no option tied to him, so he's a free agent. To be able to get rid of Aviles, Jerry Sands is not a guy that you'll extend a contract to after the season. Ryan Raburn, there's an option for him, but I really hope they don't pick it up. It's almost like the scene in Moneyball, frankly, where Billy Beane wants the team played a certain way, and Art Howe won't do it. So Beane takes it upon himself and trades away the players that Howe wants to play so that he can get the optimal lineup in there. And that's not something Antonetti is going to have to do via trade because these guys have expiring contracts. So the way for it to change is to take away Francona's power to get rid of those veteran guys. And when you look at it for next season, the most service time of any player on this team is going to be Michael Brantley with just over 5 years. So you're taking away that veteran element from Francona. Now you can question whether or not there's enough leadership on the team, so maybe Antonetti does need to go out and get some sort of veteran player to be a leader for this team. But he can take away some of the dead weight from this roster by just letting it go to free agency, and hopefully that's what happens.
Yeah, I think the outs with Aviles and Raburn, I think, are perfect in terms of Antonetti being able to move on and take away Aviles. I couldn't have stated better. I think that's ultimately what's going to happen. I would be really interested to see if they make a move for a more veteran guy who's actually a competent starter at a position. I think one of the other problems, too, is the Indians have a collection of veterans who exist on the fringes of the roster. And so if you're expecting leadership from a guy who isn't producing and he's playing once or twice a week, and I know leadership is just something we throw around pretty loosely anymore anyway, and I certainly don't think Francona should have to have multiple leaders on his team to keep it stable. I do think having someone who has a little playoff experience, who can play center or right, who is a legit starter would be a really nice addition.
Well, I don't want to jump down the Aviles Sands rabbit hole. I could because I could see a scenario where we see some of these guys, Raburn, back on the team, but that's for neither here nor there. Let's look at this deal, and let's look at it from Antonetti's perspective. I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty sure that in the back of my head I thought we were just stuck with Swisher and Bourn and their albatross of a contract over the next year and a half. And taking the human side of this out of it, I know a guy like Swisher really wanted to win here in Ohio. It just hasn't worked out. But taking the human side out of it, Antonetti did something I think that all of us thought was unattainable. And while it was in the back of our head, I think most of us thought maybe they could DFA one or both of these guys either in the offseason or as the season progressed next year when the salary didn't mean as much. How big a deal was it that Chris Antonetti was able to essentially, and if you take into account the Moss move, the Murphy move, the Zebchinski move, and you put it all together, regardless of what happens to that $10 million that they sent to Atlanta or however much it turns out being, essentially what Antonetti has done here is he's gotten rid of the 2 albatross contracts for next year. He's gotten rid of Moss, which would have cost him about $9 million last year. Got rid of Zebchinski, $4 to $5 million next year. And what he's done is he brought in another albatross contract at $7.5 million next year, $9 million the year after. But basically, what he's done is swapped Moss for Johnson, and then cleared the decks of $30 million for next year. Now, regardless of what we think about what happens to that $10 million, I mean, a good ownership and good front office can put aside $10 million this year that they were going to end up paying to Swisher and Bourn anyways. Basically, they're working with a clear deck next year. Now, aside from talking about what they could do in the offseason, which we'll get to in a second, how big a deal was this Antonetti move? I mean, to me, it's a home run.
Go for it, Miggy.
Yeah, I think I think this podcast is one which is just covered in love for Chris Antonetti, but, he's someone who continues to just create incredible flexibility when he needs to create financial flexibility, and he's someone who continues to grab assets when he has the opportunity. He's very opportunistic. He created incredible flexibility for 2016 and more for 2017, building around a core which is one of the best young cores in Major League Baseball, and one that he essentially helped to sculpt himself. He's brought in incredible assets, so he's someone who He's willing to admit mistakes. He's willing to make adjustments. He cleared financial room that's incredible. I think they have the ability to go out and get a really good bat now, probably via trade, but they can take on a larger contract and put in right or center or somewhere else. They'll find a fit. So he's found a way to kind of upgrade this roster, create room for a trade, or bring in another pretty costly asset, and a core that's really, really good and one that's going to win games. So I think, another big win trade for Chris Antonetti.
Yeah, I think so as well. And another thing about it is, you gain payroll flexibility, as we've talked about. You gain, roster flexibility, and also you buy yourself time, because you can unload this Chris Johnson contract if you need to in a couple of years. You can take a gamble, maybe on an underperforming pitcher that's in a similar price range. You can maybe recoup some of that $9 million by maybe trading a guy like Brian Shaw as his arbitration salary continues to rise. There are a lot of different ways Antonetti can go about, sort of negating a portion of this Johnson deal. It's a lot easier to get somebody to eat, $9 million for 2017 than it is to get somebody to eat $29 million for 2016. So, it was a very smart move. It was a savvy move. And we need to give a lot of credit to the Dolans here for this deal as well. Because, as I said on Twitter right after the deal, when Atlanta ate the Bronson Arroyo contract from Arizona wouldn't include any cash, so they wound up having to give up Touki Toussaint in that deal, who's a very promising, hard-throwing pitching prospect, a guy that's a few years away from the big leagues, but the projection is there for him to be a quality middle-of-the-rotation starter, and the Indians, all they gave up in this deal was money. And, it's easy for us to sit here and say, well, giving up $10 million is easy to do. For the Dolans, it's not an easy thing to do, but they took that financial step in order to keep a key piece of the farm system, and they deserve a lot of applause for that, and it's something that really should be commended.
Yeah, and just to jump on that real quick, it's something that they continually do, and it's something they do to acquire prospects. At last year's deadline, they could have ended up with much worse prospects than James Ramsey and Zach Walters, but both times they forked out money to cover parts of the deals in order to acquire a better asset. It's something the Dolans always do, that not a lot of fans see, but it's something that helps them to continually acquire better assets and not give up assets that most management won't do.
Well, John Hart's been acquiring young pitching talent like there's no tomorrow in Atlanta. He's been dishing away players. They have, over the past 6 to 8 months, they've acquired a boatload of good young pitchers. So it's you wonder, since we've heard about the rumblings of Chris Johnson and Nick Swisher for a couple of weeks now, you wonder if maybe that was a hang-up in the deal, ultimately got us to the waiver period where this kind of deal was a lot more easy to make. But good point by both of you. Let's look at let's look at what the Indians could do in the future. Mike and I talked off and on air yesterday about Chris Antonetti's potential plan with this club, and it seems like if you step back and you look at the moves from the time they announced Carrasco was on the trade block, or at least whatever they said, they're fishing to see how much value he's worth, which makes no sense since they already have him wrapped up for potentially 5.5 years, but that's neither here nor there. It does seem like Chris Antonetti has been on a mission to create this roster space that you mentioned, Adam, in this salary space, but also it seems like there's momentum going forward to make some other moves. The Nick Johnson or the Nick Swisher, Chris Johnson thing was mentioned a couple weeks ago, almost around the same time as the Carrasco, whatever you want to call it. And then very methodically he's gotten rid of players and then now acquired some very interesting pieces with Kaminsky. I can't remember the guy they got from the Angels.
Stamets.
But Stamets, yeah. They've acquired some interesting pieces and of differing value, but it does seem like there's dialogue going forward for Antonetti to continue a process. We heard rumblings of a discussion with Toronto. That's probably off the table because all the prospects they got rid of, but there's some interesting teams, the Dodgers, Chicago being two of them, that could come into play for a pitcher like Carrasco, who this offseason could be in high demand, especially considering, as Mike mentioned yesterday in our podcast yesterday, with guys like Price and Cueto, who are going to be demanding $100 to $200 million over 5 to 8 years. is this a process that we're still going to see play out in the offseason? Could we still see one of these starters go? And while it's a high price to pay, I know, Adam in particular, you have been looking, and Mike too, we've been looking for this bat. Are they going to, is there more to this than meets the eye? Is there a trade out there that might already be in play, similar to the Trevor Bauer deal of a few years ago, where Antonetti started building a bridge for that during the trade deadline, and then it came to fruition during the winter meetings that year?
I would be stunned if Chris Antonetti goes to the winter meetings at the end of this year in December and doesn't trade away one of Carrasco or Salazar. And what you have to look at here is, in Major League Baseball, it seems like all of these smart analytical front offices are always looking for the next inefficiency. We saw it a couple of years ago when Oakland and Tampa Bay spent large percentages of their small market payrolls on relievers, trying to shorten the game, trying to patchwork what they can with the rotation and then get to the bullpen, where they can win games that they have leads in. We sort of saw that for a little while. We saw Houston do it. In their offseason, they picked up a guy like Gregerson, a guy like Neshek. They really went out there and spent on the bullpen. And then they followed it up by being really aggressive and proactive within the organization. And I feel like Antonetti is looking at that, and, it's hard because Antonetti came up under Shapiro, where it was, about building these windows of contention. I know everybody hates that expression, but, that 3 to 5 year window where you were supposed to be competitive and sustainable. And, now we see the Royals, they go out and they basically trade away their entire pool of pitching prospect depth, to go for it this season. We see the Tigers starting to sell off pieces. They're in financial shambles. I feel like if you're Antonetti, you go into this offseason and you say, if I'm the most aggressive team in this division, then we set ourselves up very well to rattle off 2 or 3 straight. And I think that's why he's going to be really proactive at the winter meetings, get at least 1 or 2 controlled bats for one of Carrasco or Salazar, and then hope that the good depth that they've put through the minor league system can come up. Maybe a guy like Bradley Zimmer becomes an impact bat in the middle of next year. Kaminsky's a projectable left-handed arm. Ryan Merritt's another guy that they like quite a bit. Adam Plutko's had a very good season. So I feel like they think they've got some pretty good young depth in the minor leagues to go out and make a big splash and then take advantage of what's going on in this division.
Yeah. I'm just really curious what sort of bat they can go get in the offseason. And I think likely it's going to be more Carrasco. And I think having conversation about it, the value of Carrasco and Salazar, I think, is really challenging. I don't really know. I think Carrasco is ultimately the better asset, but I think gauging these two is really, really interesting. And I think different front offices and different teams could really have different valuations in terms of which one's a better asset or they're more interested in. But I absolutely expect they deal one of the starters. It won't be Bauer because Bauer just doesn't have the necessary value to really bring in the bat that you need. But that doesn't make him any less valuable to the Indians in terms of solidifying the rotation. But I think there's definitely a deal out there. I also think a willingness to kind of I think Antonetti's done a really good job of kind of collecting minor league assets, and I think that more minor league assets are going to be moved than people would expect. I think that we've traditionally hoarded, and we have much more minor league depth than we have even in the past, 5 or 6 years. You can think back to a Ubaldo deal that kind of depleted the system when the only 2 significant arms in the system were White and Pomerantz. I think we could definitely easily see Kaminsky flipped in a deal, or just a guy like Justice Sheffield, plus a Frazier or a Zimmer as guys who kind of overlap in the long-term strategy. So I think we could easily see a big-time position player and pitching prospect moved for a big league bat and them not touch the rotation as well.
Well, and that's one of the things I kind of drew a parallel to during all these Carrasco negotiations is that, the Indians don't have money to go spend in free agency. What they do have and what they are building is maybe a quasi-financial asset in having these controlled, really talented young players that basically serve as currency on the trade market. And that's probably why a guy like Carrasco would have more trade value than a Salazar, because his extension's already locked in. With Salazar, you really don't know what's going to happen with his contract status going forward. There's risk factors with both guys. Carrasco's a past Tommy John guy. Salazar, people have always been worried about the durability of him, but it's a really good problem to have, to sit here and basically nitpick apart our controlled starting pitchers to see which one has more trade value. And like you said, Bauer's a guy you take out of the equation, not just because he doesn't have the same upside, but because I don't think that there are a lot of organizations out there that are as equipped or as open-minded as the Indians are, to deal with his quirkiness, to deal with his non-traditional methods. The Indians have been very, very open-minded with him, and he's been comfortable, and I think that's part of the reason why he's been able to have the success that he has. That probably doesn't happen somewhere else, and executives around the league know that. So it's basically Carrasco and Salazar, and then we see what we can get out of them, because you're going to have a bidding war on those two guys, and like Jim said, Antonetti laid a lot of groundwork at the deadline. He now has a very good idea of what Carrasco's worth, and like I said, if Carrasco finishes out the season strong, you're no longer talking about a half season of dominant starting pitching performance. You're talking about a season and a half, which that's going to mean a whole lot more to talent evaluators and front office personnel.
Yeah, well, the thing about Carrasco, too, that's interesting to me in a lot of levels is the Indians over the years have been really, really smart with starting pitchers. And I know they take a lot of heat for not going after free agents and letting people walk, as they did with Casimir and Ubaldo a couple years ago. But they're really smart with these guys who are entering their 28, 29, 30-year range. Which why, and Adam, you kind of sarcastically, I don't know, maybe it wasn't sarcastically, mentioned Kluber to me on Twitter the other day. I wonder if he's not in the equation as well. He seems to be entering that, and I hate to use the term, but window in which the Indians like to kind of back away. And I'm not saying, they signed him to long-term deals. I think they obviously meant those long-term deals, or they wouldn't have signed them, and they did save the Indians money over the duration of those deals. But I wouldn't be surprised to see either one of those two go based simply upon the way that they have handled their starting pitching and free agent starting pitchers over the years. They usually like one-year deals with guys that age. This is really the first time not the first time because they've done it in the past, but I would be interested to see where they go this offseason. We're also a year away from a Cy Young award, which could make Kluber part of the equation as well. Although if I'm a GM, Carrasco would be the guy I'd be looking for too. All right, so let's have some fun, because immediately yesterday, after they get rid of all of this money and you start looking at the financials for next year, they're dependent on what they do with that $10 million. They're at about $63 million for payroll. This isn't including filling the roster or whatever. They have about $20 million, give or take, to fill the roster. Immediately, people start discussing signing free agents. Now, I don't know how y'all feel about this, but after watching Antonetti get rid of two high-priced free agents, there is no way Antonetti's going to sign a couple of high-priced free agents again, right? We're done with this. This is going to be a team that builds through trade and through a developing minor league system, correct? Don't worry, Mike. I can edit it out, but I'm going to point to you.
Okay, I can go here. I think the most likely deal is the Indians do a couple of short-term fixes, specifically center field. I think there are a couple of guys that the Indians would be willing to go with maybe like 2 and 25 and a 1-year option. The list is something like Austin Jackson, Colby Rasmus, and Dexter Fowler. I think those are the three. So I think one of the things they'll do, and it won't eat up their whole payroll flexibility, is they'll do a 2 and 20 deal, something like that, for someone who immediately kind of creates a league average starter and center fielder, which is something we've been missing. And then I think they go out and trade, and I guess Puig doesn't fit into this category because he's so cheap, but I think they would then acquire a right fielder or maybe a first base DH type who's a little more costly and eats up the other space, and then maybe they throw another couple million at a relief arm. I would expect that's how the money's spent, less so than throwing $20 million a year or 18 at, I don't know who they would afford at $18 million a year, because I think everyone in this market of quality is going to be either in the $10 million range or in the 20 plus.
I think free agency is getting increasingly difficult, not just for the Indians, but for everybody in the league, because we're seeing a lot of these teams go ahead and buy up players' arbitration years, buy a couple years of their free agency, and guys are hitting the free agent market older than they have in the past, at least for the first time in the free agent market. And that's something that the Indians are going to shy away from, and Jim, that's something that you already mentioned. They try not to take on risk with guys that are 30 and over, and they did it with Bourn and Swisher, and we saw the outcome. So in terms of free agent signings, it's really hard to see them being very active here. I mean, I think maybe a guy like Rajay Davis would interest them. He's kind of a complementary piece, though, in my opinion. I really don't think that he's too much of a starter type of guy. Dexter Fowler and Austin Jackson would certainly be interesting. Jackson's not much of a hitter, but he is a pretty decent defender. Maybe Denard Span's injury-filled year kind of shies people away from him. I don't know. But a name to keep an eye on for the 2017 free agent class would be somebody like Josh Redick. Now, when you look at Oakland, you look at what they're doing. Contention from year to year is kind of the goal there, but based on some of the moves that they've made, what they have right now in the starting rotation, they're probably a team that's not necessarily looking toward 2016. So maybe you can go get a guy like Redick, especially because Redick was critical of Billy Beane and the way that they trade players away. When they traded away Scott Kazmir, and it was Josh Donaldson making similar comments that got him shipped out of Oakland. And he's gone on and raked for Toronto, and Oakland really got the short end of the stick in that deal. But a guy like Redick could be a one-year fix in right field for a team that could really use his power upside, and he's one of the best hitters against right-handed pitching in baseball. So I think that may be an option that they look at. Free agency just isn't a thing for them. They will look to trade for guys that are signed for a year and a half, 2 years, and that's just the way that they have to operate, because like it or not, they're probably going to be gun-shy about signing free agents after the Swisher and Bourn debacles. And I've said countless times that prior to the 2013 season, I agreed with both of those signings, and I would still make them today if we could, jump in the time machine and go back. But it's just not the way that they operate. And I think that the creation of this financial flexibility is to go out and trade for a bat that has, a salary that fits comfortably into that flexibility.
Yeah, well, I think too, looking at you mentioned a guy like Redick. Billy Beane, Friedman from the Dodgers, even though their payroll's over $300 million, Epstein from the Cubs. I mean, these are three guys that are definitely willing to deal, and definitely we have players that we're willing to deal with. You mentioned a guy like Redick, and the minute you say Redick, I think the Indians could have him, and I think they could have him for a smaller price than people think. I mean, I think if you threw a J-Ram out there as a primary piece, I mean, that's the kind of guy I think that would interest a Billy Beane, especially on a guy whose contract's ending up quickly. So an interesting name to look at. I don't know. It's going to be a fun offseason. I'm just going to go ahead and say this just because I want to step back and watch. You don't think Chris Johnson was brought in so they could deal Carlos Santana? Sorry.
Oh, God, I hope not. I mean, like Mike said on Twitter yesterday, he's like, an 18 to 25 home run guy with a 350, 360 on base percentage, in what's essentially a pretty bad year for him. I mean, that has a ton of value, and it's a team-friendly contract, and I think the problem here is that people that want to run Santana out of town, they don't know how to accurately value a player. I don't know how many times I've been standing on the porch and I hear people bitch about his batting average, and people are just, because batting average is the only stat that's up there on the lineup card. So everybody thinks that that's the primary way to evaluate a player, and it kills me. I watched Carlos Santana go from 0-2 to 3-2 twice yesterday, including the ninth inning off Glenn Perkins, fouled off a couple really good high fastballs, got bailed out on a check swing call, but then worked a walk, and I mean, it's hard for a lot of people to understand the value of that, but he's a great hitter with elite plate discipline, elite pitch recognition, and you're not going to get back the proper amount of value for him, especially now because there's going to be this perception that the Indians are are just trying to get rid of him, and everyone's going to want to know why. Because smart people around the league understand the value that Santana has.
Yeah, the Chris Johnson makes Santana somehow expendable narrative is just such a complete joke, and I think
Mike, you have the stat of the day on him, by the way. You got to share it, and I know you know which one I'm talking about. Comparing him to Santana in particular.
Well, I don't know which one. I went on some sort of rampage about their WAR, and I think it depends how you value WAR. I'm a WAR proponent just in terms of these sorts of situations. In terms of quick, like off-the-cuff comparisons, but ultimately Chris Johnson's best season doesn't match Santana's worst season in the full season, so I think that's pretty easy to grasp. Just to me, I don't completely understand it. I think Santana has tremendous trade value, and I'm always willing to trade almost any player depending on the return, so I'm not unwilling to trade Santana, but I don't favor trading him in a down season, and I certainly think he's incredibly challenging to replace, and I don't think we're making a deal of Santana for someone else who plays first and hits 20 homers and has that OBP. I don't see them matching that value-wise. I see them getting maybe an upper-end prospect or good, maybe a back-of-the-rotation starter, but I don't see them making a one-for-one deal, challenge deal for another first baseman who can match his production. So for a team that's offensively challenged, replacing his production is pretty challenging. So I just don't see how that would work. But I know lots of others who despise Santana because he doesn't hit 300. I'm sure they're all ready to walk in.
Well, I think the important thing to remember here is, as you said, Mike, there's nobody off the table. As Chris Antonetti has proved time and time again, if there's the right deal to be made, he'll make that deal. This Chris Johnson deal does not. Gosh, if Chris Antonetti deals Carlos Santana because they got Chris Johnson, then I think all three of us can come back on here and we'll appropriately talk about Chris Antonetti for making a bad move. I mean, if the right deal comes to Cleveland for Carlos Santana, I think we'd all agree he'd make it. But that right deal this year probably isn't going to happen unless you put together some crazy package of players that incorporates one of the starting pitchers and brings back a large haul from somebody who values Carlos Santana the same way that we do. And even in this market today, with the way he's played, even a guy like Friedman would probably soft sell Santana. So I think that the reality of the situation is he's more valuable to us than he is to any other team. So he's staying here. The key is to get another bat in some form or fashion to put around him to help foster the rest of this offensive lineup. And guys, I'm going to go ahead and end it there. Great conversation about the trade. Going forward, as we start talking about this 2015 season, if there's anything to talk about, tune in to EverybodyHatesCleveland.com, the podcast. I'm going to try to pull in a bunch of people here to talk. I hope Adam can be here a lot more. Mike's here way too much, and of course I ramble on a lot too. So tune in to EverybodyHatesCleveland.com. We got a lot of stuff going on. Browns, whatever. We're just going to talk Indians for now, though, because that's kind of what we do. We'll see you soon.